In this vid, I'm going to be taking a look at bobononeable's version of Zekrom. While Zekrom typically just runs with Pachirisu and Shaman and maybe a few other things, bobononeable adds a Magnezone Prime to his in order to get sufficient draw power. It's a really interesting tech, so let's see how it works. Your deck has a very strong starting line of 3 Manaphy, which allows you to shuffle your hand in and draw 5. It requires 1 energy card, but unlike the Cleffa, it doesn't go to sleep, and it has a little bit more HP so it can survive a donk. I would recommend dropping your line of 3 down to 2, and including 1 Tyrogue so that hopefully you can get the donk off of your opponent, and you never know when you might be able to Tyrogue stall later in the game as you finish getting setting up. Your Zekrom strategy is pretty typical. You run 3 Zekrom, and you aim to Bolt Strike every turn for 120. In order to get those 2 Lightning Energy on, you use Pachirisu's Shelf Generation to attach them in 1 turn when you play it onto the bench. You attach 1 card manually for the turn, and then use Shaman Celebration Wind to move those Lightning Energy from Pachirisu to Zekrom, allowing him to attack, hopefully turn 1 or turn 2. One card that I might suggest adding is 1, maybe 2 Unknown Darks. When you play it onto the bench, you get to search your deck for a dark Pokemon. This can ensure that you get the donk T1, T2. If you have 1 Zekrom and a Pokemon Collector, you can search for Pachirisu, attach the 2 Lightning Energy, use Unknown, search for the Dark Energy, and use that Dark Energy as your manual attachment, and then use Shaman Celebration Wind to just move it all around. The interesting thing about this deck is it has a draw engine of Magnezone Prime. You run a 3-2-3 line, but I'm afraid that this might be just too heavy. Your bench is already going to be pretty full with Pachirisus and Shamans, so I might recommend decreasing this down to a 2-1-2. While this is primarily a draw engine in the deck, you can always attach to it and be able to do Lost Burn to knock out a very heavy attacker. Your deck consists of 13 electric and 2 rainbow energies. I don't think Shaman is a very strong attacker, so I would drop the 2 rainbow energy and put in 2 dark energy if you decide to run the unknown. If you don't decide to run the unknown, I would just turn those into more electric energy or just drop them completely, because I think there's a few more things we can add to your trainer and supporter line to make it a bit stronger. The first thing I would do is increase your line of Seeker and Super Scoop Up from 2 each to 4 each. I know that might seem a bit heavy, and while I'm not a fan of the flippiness of Super Scoop Up, the point of this deck is to be able to reuse those Pachirisu and Shaman so that you don't have to waste all the bench space. Therefore, maxing out these lines is going to be huge. I would also increase your line of Junk Arms to 3, maybe even 4, so that you can reutilize those Scoop Ups as well as any other cards in this deck. I would also recommend throwing in 3, if not 4 Defender. Because of the errata, it not only reduces 20 damage from the attack from your opponent, but it also reduces the damage done to Zekrom from its own attack. So instead of doing 40 to itself on Zekrom's attack, it would only do 20, and then it would still reduce from your opponent's damage as well. This is going to make your Zekrom last a lot longer. To search out for basic Pokemon, you run 2 Dual Ball and 1 Pokemon Collector. Since the majority of this deck consists of basic Pokemon, I would highly recommend increasing this number. I would say 3 Pokemon Collector and maybe 2 Dual Ball, and then you can always use your Pokemon Communication to swap those in for the evolution cards that you need for Magnezone. You run 3 Communication, which I think is a perfect number, and I'd leave that the same. You run 3 Rare Candy, which I think you can reduce down to 1, because I believe your bench is already going to be pretty crowded, so I would only want 1 Magnezone on the bench at a time. Therefore, I only want to use 1 Rare Candy. You run 1 Flower Shop to be able to recover those energy and Pokemon from the discard pile, but I would also recommend throwing in 1 Twins just in case you're behind. You have a few more recovery cards in this deck, 1 Energy Retrieval and 1 Revive. Since you have 15 energy in the deck, I don't think you'll need the energy retrieval, but if you decide to cut that line of energy down to make room for some of the other trainers and supporters I've suggested in this deck, then keeping it in would be a good idea. I also like the 1 Revive. You might want to increase that to 2 if you can, since this deck relies on Zekrom so much, but again, you might not have the room, so the 1 Revive should be sufficient. You run 1 Juniper, which I think is perfect, enough to get you a nice fresh new hand, but not enough to run the risk of decking yourself. You run 2 interviewers questions. Because you're running 15 energy, I don't think you're going to have a problem drawing into them, but at the same time you want to be able to have several energy in your hand so you can reuse it with Pachirisu. So this is kind of an up to you. If you're finding that the way the deck runs you're able to draw into plenty of energy, I would skip the interviewers. If you're finding that you're having a hard time, especially if you decide to reduce your amount of energy, then maybe sticking with 1 interviewers, but there's already so many things like the Seeker and Scoop Up that I think are more important to add to this deck at the moment. The interviewers may be a card that can be expendable. You run 1 switch, which I think is fine. Typically I would say you can drop it since you don't run the babies and don't run the risk of them being sleeping on your turn. However, with Magnezone Prime, there's a good chance that someone can Pokemon Catcher or Reversal it up just to stall for a little while, and rather than paying that heavy retreat cost, you can just use your switch. I would drop the 2 Elm to try and make room in this deck for some of your other cards. You're going to be able to search out for those evolution cards pretty easily with Pokemon Communication, so I don't think Elm is a requirement. Even if you run up against a Vileplume deck, you can easily survive without your Magnezone and just rely on your Pokemon collectors to search out for your basics and hit hard with Zekrom. And the last suggestion I have is to tweak your hand refresher line. Right now you only have 2 Pont. I would like to see probably 2 Pont, and if you can find room for it, 1 or 2 Judge. If you can get your Magnezone up and judge your opponent, that allows you to still draw into a few extra cards, but can really disrupt your opponent. So I know I made quite a few suggestions, and it might be difficult finding room for all of them, so you might have to reduce your energy line. Again, reducing that Manamphy line and maybe throwing in a Tyrogue, and reducing the Magnezone line will also help you get there. I've also seen a lot of decks that safely runs 2 Shaman instead of 3, so that's another thing that you can consider. Thank you for watching, and if you would like your deck reviewed, just PM me the list and let me know whether you'd like to have a chance at a video review, which is going to take several weeks, or if you just like a fast result of a blog review, which I can do in a few days.